Ryan Poles isn't going to tell us everything he's planning for the upcoming NFL draft, but in his press conference leading up to the big draft day, he gave us some hints about what could be in store for the Bears or where they see the direction of the draft going.
You are Locked On Bears, your daily Chicago Bears podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
This is Locked On Bears, and I'm your host, Lorin Cox. I'm an analyst for Pro Football Focus, and I'm here to bring you your daily, in-depth Chicago Bears news and analysis. You can follow me on Twitter at CoxSports1. You can follow the podcast on Twitter at Locked On Bears. You can like Locked On Bears on Facebook. Join the Locked On Bears Facebook group for even more Bears talk. And make sure you hit that subscribe button on the Locked On Bears YouTube channel to keep up with all of our video podcasts as well. Thanks for making Locked On Bears your first listen today and hopefully every day. On the show, we previewed what's in store for the Bears in this upcoming draft. We'll hear from the general manager, Ryan Poles, talking about their interest, their seemingly strong interest in trading down and kind of what he's looking for in a potential deal to trade down, what will be the motivating factors if he indeed does so at some point in this draft. We'll also talk about where he's seeing the depth in this draft class, the positions he sees being stronger later on, and then kind of the inverse of that. If he didn't see those positions being stronger later on, then maybe it's the other positions he might prioritize a little bit earlier, perhaps. And finally, we'll wrap up with talk about the wide receiver position and a clear emphasis from the general manager on drafting and developing as opposed to a big name free agent signing or getting in on one of these massive trades for one of the superstars that's been available throughout this off season. But I think when you see Chicago Bears fans go through mock draft simulations and put out their own mock drafts for this draft, most commonly, right, everyone wants to trade down. Even that's pretty common every year. Most fans at some point in the draft want to add more draft picks. And of course, on draft day, that can be easier said than done because for every team that wants to trade down, they would have to find a partner willing to trade up. But it sounds like Ryan Poles and the Chicago Bears front office is saying that for themselves, they're going to be open for business in terms of moving down. And then he didn't rule out the possibility of potentially moving back up at times if they acquire the necessary draft capital to give them that flexibility.
You've obviously experienced the draft under 3 different general managers in Kansas City. What have you done philosophically to develop a stance on when it makes sense to trade up, when it makes sense to trade back, and how does that change based on the day of the draft it is?
Yeah, so I think the biggest thing is how many players you have at a certain level. So can you move back and get a quality player at that next spot? And then also take into consideration where, when you get kicked other picks, that's an additional player. So where is that pick located at in the draft? And can I still get a quality player at that level as well? Also, you can accumulate on the back end and you can package things up and move them again. So really it's just the volume and where the draft is deep in certain positions.
You guys moved up a bunch in Kansas City. What makes it
A go time decision for you to go up and get a guy?
Yeah, it comes back down to your board. So there's different values on your board, and if you have certain players that are in a certain section of the board and it makes sense for your team at that time, then that's something you have to do at the right time. But I think you have to know kind of where your team's at and how many picks you have, and it's a big picture decision because there is an effect of losing picks to move up and get that player.
Right. You were a part of draft that you're describing, the remodel, and you saw that at the time you don't have a first round pick. All you have is a second round and a third rounder. How did you view that part of the challenge as far as trying to construct a team that you wanted, looking at one you inherited that had a lot of holes, and having very limited draft capital to work with?
Yeah, it's definitely a challenge, but at the same time, that's why I was hired. That's why our group is doing what we do, is to take what we have and construct the best roster we can and have the best draft we can. I do think we will be in the business depending on where it is and what it looks like and moving back and trying to create more. So that's just what we've been handed, and we're going to maximize that.
Now, for full transparency there, that was two separate parts of Ryan Poles' press conference there, clipped together about 2/3 of the way through. So that wasn't all in succession the way it went chronologically, but of course, all on the same topics. That's why I combined them there in that same in the same kind of vein. So I think for Ryan Poles, you get this impression that, like, yes, they do want to trade down and will be maybe even eager to trade down, but they're not going to trade down just for the sake of trading down. Like, yes, they do want more draft picks generally, but I think specifically they want draft picks in the areas of the draft that they feel particularly strong about, where they see the depth at certain positions, right? Because it can vary by position. It's not just like, oh, the third round in general is strong, but maybe it's more like, well, the third round offensive linemen are strong, but maybe the third round wide receivers aren't as strong. So if you get to 39 or whatever, and maybe, there's still a receiver there and you don't feel like you can trade down and still get one, maybe you stay at 39 because you don't like the receivers in that round of the draft, or the defensive lineman or the offensive lineman, or whatever positional value they're going to associate here, right? They're not just going to trade down for the sake of adding more draft picks, although that's very much what they would like to do when they don't have the type of draft capital that they're looking for. I mean, I think when you look at the Bears draft picks right now, they pick, 71st in the third round is where their third round pick is. And then they don't have a pick in the fourth round. It's not till later in the fifth round. It's like another 70 picks in between the Bears' third round pick and the next pick after that. So you might imagine that maybe that's a range they would be looking to acquire more draft picks so they can get into that spot and not have such a massive gap in between their picks. So does that mean moving down from 39 or moving down from 48 or moving down from 71 or some combination between the three of them? It's hard to say for sure, but that seems to be like where I would expect that range to happen potentially. But at the same time, if they see a playmaker on the board, or an impact player, I should say, at a position that they value, I don't think they're going to feel like inclined or pressured to trade down if there is truly a player that they like. And it's going to speak more about where they see other players in this draft later on that sets up how they decide moving up or down. Speaking of players coming later on, we'll hear from the general manager here on what exactly the plan is and where they're seeing some of the depth in this draft class later on. In one position in particular, he seemed to be surprised and a little bit almost fired up about just how many quality players there are in this draft that maybe could lead the Bears using a late round pick, or at the very least, some priority free agents. We'll kind of go through the strengths of the later rounds of this draft class and where the Bears see them next on Locked On Bears. We are not far from Mother's Day, and if you're looking for that perfect Mother's Day gift, our friends at BlueNile.com are here to help you find the perfect gift that she'll cherish forever. Whether she prefers a statement piece or everyday subtle elegance, BlueNile.com has the fine jewelry options for every mom. You can shop high-quality classic diamond earrings, elegant tennis bracelets, or gemstone pendant necklaces. They make it super easy with expert advice 24 hours a day, legendary service with 30-day returns, free shipping, high-quality standards, and really ethically sourced diamonds and jewelry. They've been the original online jeweler since 1999, and they've helped millions create their perfect jewelry piece for any occasion, not just Mother's Day. But this Mother's Day, give mom something she'll treasure forever with fine jewelry from BlueNile.com. Locked On Bears listeners can get $50 off your purchase of $500 or more. It's a podcast exclusive that's only good through Mother's Day. Use our promo code LOCKEDON. That's LOCKEDON, Locked On. Plus, every order is insured, ships for free, and arrives in discreet packaging that won't give away what's inside. Shop stress-free and find your forever piece. Go to BlueNile.com. Chicago Bears are looking for some long-term pieces for themselves in this draft. And while, they're obviously open for a lot of potential positions early on, they're also evaluating bigger picture, right? Where is the depth in this draft class? Where do they see the rounds that they need to get certain positions? Can they afford to wait on the offensive line? Can they afford to wait at defensive back, your defensive line, wherever you want to see your positions. Where do you feel like you have to get them early, and where do you feel like, I can wait and still get a pretty good quality player at this position? Maybe there's not as much drop-off between the third and the fifth round at one spot as there is between the third and the fifth round at another spot. Of course, the team's never going to tell us exactly how they feel about all the positions and where exactly their board is stacked up, but Ryan Poles did give us some of a peel back behind the curtain of where they see some of the later round depth in this draft classes and the positions maybe they would be a little more inclined to wait for, depending on how this draft board plays out.
Speaking of drop-off, when you get to Friday and Saturday this weekend, what positions do you see having maybe more talent than some of the others?
I would say the O-line depth is pretty good. There's some good depth with the DBs. There's a couple of defensive linemen. The running back class may not be top-heavy, but there's like a ton. It's crazy how many running backs are. I think a lot of it has to do with, the COVID year. A lot of those guys are kicking back, so at middle to bottom, definitely in the free agency, there's a massive amount of players. That's why it took so much time to get the board set, not only at the top but at the bottom. There are a lot of players on this board.
So some of the positions he mentioned there I would constitute as bigger needs than others, but of course they're always going to take a pretty holistic approach to looking at every position in the NFL draft and not really rule out anything. But of course, you wouldn't expect them to use an early draft pick on a running back anyway, but that's the one he seemed to be really kind of fired up and excited about there. And it kind of raises the David Montgomery question a little bit, right? Not necessarily that they would immediately try and trade him or anything, but Montgomery is in the last year of his contract, and scheme-wise, he fits into Luke Getsy's offense, but maybe he's not. Maybe a better fit was more of what they asked him to run in Matt Nagy's offense. He's more of an inside zone than an outside zone runner. And this is not a disparage David Montgomery podcast right now, but I'm just pointing out there that maybe they use another sixth or trade and get a seventh-round pick on a running back, and then you let David Montgomery walk as a free agent next year, get a compensatory pick for him, and then you roll with Khalil Herbert and the guy you draft this year. If you really like the draft class, maybe you sign an undrafted running back too and just start to build out the depth there a little bit more. Again, and there's not this rush to move on from Montgomery, but you prepare for your potential options. If he's not exactly what they want in the scheme, are they going to want to pay him top running back money? It's sort of a different discussion there. But also he said good depth, pretty good was the word he used to describe the offensive line depth. Good depth at defensive back. He said couple of defensive linemen, but overall, those are kind of the spots he mentioned. And that lines up with some of the things we've talked about on this podcast, right? That there are offensive linemen, not only this year, but most years, right? You can find decent offensive linemen in the third, fourth, and even fifth round. You can look at Larry Borum last year, for example, but there have been plenty of examples across the NFL of not that you necessarily want to go into week one starting your fifth-round rookie on the offensive line, but more so that starting offensive linemen have been more often developed, as fifth and fourth-round picks compared to, say, other positions that might not develop into starters quite as frequently and as regularly as the offensive line at times has seemed to be that type of a position. Now, the need for the Bears on the offensive line is so great that ideally you don't wait until the fifth round to take an offensive lineman, that you get one early enough to be able to more directly count on them as a regular starter this rookie season, because you need really a right guard and maybe an offensive tackle in there too at some point here. So remains to be seen what the Bears kind of see there. But notice he didn't say wide receiver, right? That was the part that jumped out to me there, that they feel like there's some later round depth at offensive line and defensive back, but didn't. And it's not to say that we should expect that to be the thorough list of here's all the positions we think have depth. He was just sort of naming some off the top of his head. But the fact that maybe wide receiver wasn't one of those positions that was front of his mind, off the top of his head, spot that they see a lot of depth in, could maybe indicate a little bit that they see that as more of an earlier potential priority, that if you're going to get a guy that you feel like can be a difference maker, maybe you have to do it early, whether that's one of the 2 second-round picks or maybe the third-round pick. But I don't think the Bears are necessarily seeing, at least he didn't indicate that the Bears are seeing a ton of that in the 5th and 6th rounds, because to some extent, how much more does a 6th-round pick at wide receiver this year give you than, say, Daz Newsome last year, or some of the other guys they've signed in free agency, like David Moore or Equanimous St. Brown? So is it second round or bust? at wide receiver for this draft class? I mean, not necessarily, but it would seem like that could be where the Bears are looking at the draft board potentially there. I'm surprised he also didn't mention tight end in one of those spots because it's a pretty good tight end draft class, and I'm surprised we didn't hear maybe a little bit more of that. And the other one he didn't mention was linebacker that stands out too, that the Bears have been linked to a lot of those like day 2, day 3 linebackers or early day 3 linebackers, and maybe that's another position that could be more of a second, third round choice, or maybe not at all, or maybe obviously like undrafted free agents. So I think there's potential here for some different options for the Bears, and you can see where they might feel comfortable waiting, where they might feel a little bit less comfortable waiting. It's clear that for the wide receiver position in particular, though, that generally speaking, the draft seems to be the way they want to go. I mean, free agent dollars kind of speak for themselves as to throw in a lot of one-year deals at that spot and not big long-term contract for Allen Robinson or any of the other free agents. We'll kind of check in on what Ryan Poles' philosophy seems to be at that position in particular and how that affects the rest of the team-building plans here for the rest of the offseason next on Locked On Bears. It's draft day, or at least day one of the draft, and time to get your bets in with our friends at BetOnline.net. They've got a ton of different props and different ways you can slice and dice this draft, including for your Chicago Bears. You can bet on what position the Bears will draft with their first pick, no matter where that first pick happens. I think the odds-on favorite right now is, as you might expect, wide receiver. Offensive line was up there. Cornerback was up there. Safety was a little bit farther down than I thought. Linebacker was up there. Of course, the longest odds were like special teamers and quarterbacks, but a lot of different ways to slice and dice it, plus odds on the first round, on who goes first, second, third, how many players at each position are drafted in the first round, some top 32 odds on whether or not certain players will be in the first round when it's all said and done. So many different ways to use your draft knowledge to your advantage. And BetOnline.net is the top source for all of your betting information needs. All of the sports wagering stuff, from live betting to all the other sports, NBA playoffs, hockey, soccer, tennis, boxing, esports, and more. Head on over to the website today or use your mobile device to learn more about the trends and action you need to know. BetOnline, where the game starts. 99.9% of Chicago Bears fans, dare I say 100% of Chicago Bears fans, want to see the team add at wide receiver. Specifically, probably draft a wide receiver earlier rather than later, but that's the number one thing, right? Give Justin Fields more weapons, at least perceptionally. That's the number one thing. You can make some pretty strong arguments of let's focus on the offensive line first and then wide receiver second, which is, a little bit more where I fall right now given the size of the need at offensive line. But regardless, everybody wants to see the Bears add at wide receiver. How you want to prioritize it, you can debate that separately. But it's a position where you still see a vacancy, right? You have Mooney and Pringle and Equanimeous St. Brown and David Moore and Daz Newsome, but that's not a lot of proven talent. And so it hasn't been this major priority for Ryan Poles this offseason, and he seems to be taking more the long-term approach at that position, that even as Tyreek Hill is made available and traded to the Dolphins, and of course Devontae Adams traded to the Raiders, and not that the Bears had a shot at Devontae Adams, but now you've got Deebo Samuel potentially available from the 49ers. DK Metcalf has kind of always been in this conversation of, is he available, is he not? Even A.J. Brown from the Tennessee Titans, is he available, is he not? Does he want to be there, does he not? It's been a bit unprecedented this offseason, all the different wide receivers that have been available, and from what we can tell from Ryan Poles, the Bears just aren't really all that interested, at least not in paying the types of price tags it would take to get some of those players, and instead, his focus is much more on the NFL draft.
Ryan, with how many receivers out there and other teams have been putting in trade requests to try to get out of their teams and get somewhere else, does that give you, is that intriguing for a general manager to maybe put in those calls to see if those people can, want to come here?
Yeah, it's always intriguing, especially, with a lot of those talented guys, but this goes back to some of the things I talked about before, just in terms of staying disciplined. I truly believe in homegrown talent. I truly believe in drafting the right players and developing them here, and that'll help us in the long run. Especially, we see the cost of a lot of these top receivers is crazy. So it would benefit us to make sure we draft well and develop our own guys.
when Ryan Poles says, believing in homegrown talent and developing, I think that goes twofold. Like, obviously, yes, he uses the word draft and develop like twice, 2 or 3 times in that 45 seconds of answering or whatever the length was there. That, yes, obviously, a big part of that is drafting these players, building them, growing them yourselves, and not having to pay, multiple premium draft picks to trade for them, and then a big contract extension on top of that. But I think the other aspect of this too, when you talk about homegrown talent, can still include free agents, because I think it's about developing them at home, right? In the sense that, not that if, say, like you sign Byron Pringle to Chicago on a relatively cheap 1-year deal. He got a little bit more than the rest of them, but like Equinemius St. Brown too, or David Moore, right? Any of those 3 that you sign as free agents on short sort of prove-it deals, if they prove something and take that next step and develop in Chicago, then they're not so much like homegrown in the sense that the Bears did not draft them. But if the Bears are the ones that develop them, that's what creates such a value for the team, either in the value they give you on the field as a quality player, or if they were to leave in free agency and the compensatory pick market, they could create some value there, or if you're able to sign them at some kind of good value or trade them at some point as well. Like there's immense value in being able to get the players in an inexpensive way, whether that's a draft pick, a single draft pick of drafting them, or signing them as unheralded free agents and developing them yourselves into something greater. It's not exclusive to the NFL draft, but that does seem to be what the Bears want to do, or what Ryan Poles wants to do. I mean, he seemed pretty darn clear there. That's like he's like, yeah, it's intriguing, but like we're going to stay disciplined. Like almost not exactly ruling it out, but kind of ruling out like strategies other than trying to draft and develop those receivers because they're so expensive and because it's the better team building process. So that would signal pretty strongly to me that they really do want to draft a wide receiver, whether that's at 39 or 48 or 71 or even, I guess, later in the draft. But if you sort of combine like that part of, yes, we want to draft and develop wide receivers with the previous part of not really mentioning wide receivers as a later round deep position in this draft, 2 and 2 together would say they want to draft and develop a wide receiver earlier in the draft rather than later. And that's, yes, what we would sort of hope for and expect, but it's the closest I think we can get to them outright telling us that, yes, they agree, and that is what they want to do and sort of plan to do if the draft board and the situation plays out in a way that sets that up. Otherwise, they could look at trading down like we talked about earlier and maybe taking some of these other positions earlier on in this draft. A lot of different ways the team could go. It's going to be fun to watch. I mean, really, today, the first round probably won't have too much action for us watching, but certainly tomorrow is going to be an exciting, unpredictable day 2. Whatever happens in that first round, you can be sure we'll get you all set up for the best players available on day 2 for tomorrow's podcast and kind of go through what the Bears' options might be with those 2 second-round picks and maybe in the third round as well. So make sure you keep tuning in and subscribe to the Locked On Bears podcast to keep up with all of our daily, in-depth Chicago Bears news and analysis. Thanks for making Locked On Bears your first listen today. Don't forget that the Locked On Podcast Network is going to be live during the entire NFL draft. The first time our coverage is coming live from our studios in Dallas. We've got some of our hosts down there. The rest of us will be joining in remotely. Pick-by-pick analysis from our local team experts and our NFL draft gurus. Tune in all 3 days as our draft team guides you through every pick and every trade in real time. It all starts tonight at 6 o'clock Central, available on the Locked On NFL YouTube channel, as well as on the Odyssey app. I will see you there when the Bears are on the clock, or if they trade down, or whatever the Bears end up doing in the draft. I'll be jumping on to break that down and so much more. So I hope you'll tune into that and then come back for the Locked On Bears on Friday, and then we'll break down the draft picks on Monday as well, and so much more post-draft coverage coming your way. So I hope you're feeling ready for the draft. I hope you're excited, and I hope the Locked On Bears podcast is making you feel that much easier to bear down.